Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. We left off on our last episode with the Roman conquest of Samnium and the incorporation of the different Samnite tribes into the Roman sphere of influence. Although all of these different tribes were brought in with what were essentially bilateral treaties, with each tribe getting their own personal deal with Rome as it relates to citizenship, the right to vote, and paying taxes, every one of them was required to supply soldiers in the event Rome found herself in another war. This practice, of course, proved extremely fruitful for Rome, and it really set the stage for Rome's continued success in the Italian peninsula and then within the wider Mediterranean. If you remember from our last episode, the Etruscans had found themselves mixed in with a few of the Samnite wars, and although they had been on the losing side, they hadn't been completely defeated or subjugated. Rome had been fighting the Etruscans for hundreds of years by now, all the way back to the initial founding and through the time of the kings, and the Romans definitely never forgot an enemy, or even more, especially how the Etruscans had tried to reinstall the ousted kings back at the beginning of the Republic. After the Samnite Wars ended in 304 BC, the Etruscans were really only a shadow of their former selves, and they no longer posed such a looming threat as they once had to Rome. Now, the Romans had conquered Veii back in 396 BC, and so the original Etruscan League of the 12 city-states was not even intact anymore by 304. So, when war broke out between the Etruscans and Rome in 298 BC, the Romans finally had a strong upper hand. This final war between the Etruscans and Rome was really more of a series of sporadic military battles than a sort of concentrated war that we might imagine, and throughout these battles, Rome saw themselves as the winner in each engagement. The Etruscans finally suffered a resounding defeat at the Second Battle of Lake Vadimo in 283 BC. And after that, all remaining Etruscan cities were captured and completely incorporated into Rome by the time at least of 280 BC. So, only 20 years after the end of the Samnite Wars, Rome had now managed to capture another significant portion of territory to the north, and they likewise instituted the same types of treaties with the various Etruscan city-states as they had with the Samnites and the Latins, ensuring that each one would provide more manpower for Rome's armies. The Romans didn't have to wait long to use this new manpower, and they found themselves embroiled in another major war the same year that the conflict ended with the Etruscans, which was again 280 BC. Something modern historians have pointed out is that these treaties with the Samnites, the Etruscans, and the Latins is perhaps a large part of what fueled Rome's continued desire for war. The argument is basically that Rome had to use it or lose it. If they had these treaties which provided soldiers for their armies, then they needed to enact these treaties as a way to justify their existence. It would have no doubt been tempting for the Roman Senate to go to war at any point, knowing they now had such a large army, and this could very well have been a big part of their decision-making process. So, having conquered the Samnites, the Romans controlled the region of Campania, but further to the south were still many Greek colonies and city-states. This region was often referred to by the Romans as Magna Graecia, which means Greater Greece. The Greeks had established several key colonies of their own in southern Italy over the past several hundred years, and many of these still had held strong ties with mainland Greece, both economically and culturally. But now that the Romans abutted against this territory, tensions began brewing, particularly with the Greek city-state of Tarentum, right on Italy's southern coast. This was because the people of Tarentum perceived Rome's expansion as a threat, so they appealed to the kingdom of Epirus for help, who was led by a man named King Pyrrhus. The kingdom of Epirus was situated on the western coast of mainland Greece, directly across from Tarentum, across on the Adriatic Sea. Because of their proximity, close cultural and trade ties, and quite likely because of King Pyrrhus' own ambition, Epirus agreed to help the people of Tarentum fight Rome. The actual justifications claimed for starting this war are not really clear, as we do get several different accounts from our ancient Roman authors. Many seem to indicate the Tarentines believe the Romans violated a former treaty by sailing some ships through a region that they weren't supposed to. Overall, it's probably safe to say that the Greek colonies were becoming increasingly apprehensive about Rome's rapid advance, and they were eager to try and check this advance given the earliest opportunity. King Pyrrhus managed to bring together quite a large army comprised of several different Greek allies. He sailed from Greece to southern Italy in winter at a time when the Adriatic is often plagued with stormy seas, but he was trying to use speed to his advantage. This ended up backfiring though, as bad weather did inevitably show up and a big storm scattered his ships all around the Mediterranean. So while King Pyrrhus was left trying to gather his forces and piece everything back together, the Romans had learned of these new developments, and they were themselves gathering together a large army in preparation for this war. Things did come to a head quickly, and the first ever military engagement between the Greeks and the Romans occurred later that same year, still in 280 BC. This was the first time the Roman army would ever fight against the phalanx used by Alexander the Great, and it was also the first time the Romans would ever see elephants, which King Pyrrhus had managed to bring across with him in his invasion. Rome marched 2 consular armies into southern Italy to face off against Pyrrhus, who actually first offered them a diplomatic agreement. Pyrrhus sent a delegation to tell the Roman commanders that he was only coming to help protect the people of Tarentum, and that if the Romans would agree to use him as an arbitrator, they could end things peacefully without war. However, the Romans refused to have a foreign king settle their own affairs, and so both armies took to the field. This engagement would be the Battle of Heraclea. The Romans began the day of the battle by moving their army forward from their camp to engage the army of Epirus, and in doing so they were forced to cross a river. King Pyrrhus saw this opportunity, and he sent forward his cavalry and then his infantry to engage the Romans while they crossed. Now, despite this difficulty, the Romans managed to hold their own, and it proved that neither the legions nor the phalanx would break. After a while, King Pyrrhus could see that no side was really making any headway, so he sent forward his elephants, which had been held back in reserve so far. Now, the strong charge by the elephants routed the Roman army, which fell back across the river and back to their encampment, ending the fighting for the day. This early victory boosted the morale of the Epirites and their Greek allies, and so several of the different Greek colonies sent more reinforcements to bolster the army. However, the Romans were not deterred, and they simply did what they would grow to do best, which was raise a new army. Now, thanks to their new system of treaties, 2 new legions were levied to replace all of the men that they lost from the Battle of Heraclea. And to note the significance of this, we can turn to a story told to us by Appian. Now, he tells us about an Epirite emissary by the name of Cnaeus, who is a man from Thessaly that was reportedly so renowned for his eloquence that he was often compared to Demosthenes. Cnaeus was in Rome at the beginning of this war, and he was present to see them raise these 2 new legions. When he eventually returned to King Pyrrhus, he was so alarmed by Rome's ability to quickly and effectively raise these new legions that he told King Pyrrhus, quote, "We are waging war against the Hydra." This was the first, but definitely not the last time one of Rome's enemies would feel such exasperation when seeing the manpower Rome was able to continually muster, and it was all because of her innovative system of treaties and alliances that was quite simply unparalleled in the ancient world. Throughout the upcoming winter, both sides prepared for the next battle, and in the spring of 279 BC, King Pyrrhus invaded the region of Apulia, which stretches along southeastern Italy. Eventually, the 2 armies met and fought at the Battle of Asculum. Unfortunately for us today, the details of this battle are quite distorted and contradictory. 3 Roman authors detailed the Battle of Asculum, yet each one tells us a different story. Plutarch tells us that the battle lasted for 2 days, and that the Epirites won. Cassius Dio states the battle lasted only 1 day, but that the Romans won, while Dionysius doesn't even mention a victor at all. Either way, the general sense that we can glean from our ancient accounts is that it was another hard-fought battle, and that King Pyrrhus' elephants caused more devastating losses for the Romans, while the Epirites also lost many men. It was after this battle at Asculum that Plutarch offers us a now famous quote. Supposedly, when one of King Pyrrhus' lieutenants was congratulating him on his victory after this battle, King Pyrrhus replied by saying, quote, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." This has, of course, given rise to the term of a Pyrrhic victory, where one wins a victory that is so costly it makes it unclear whether or not it was actually even worth it. Following the Battle of Asculum, it seems the Carthaginians were growing anxious about the Epirite victories in Italy and that there being such a large Greek army there, and they feared that King Pyrrhus might next turn his sights towards Sicily if he ended up defeating Rome. These worries ended up being a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because once King Pyrrhus heard about the possibility of Carthage getting involved in the war, he preemptively invaded Sicily to attack them. Now, this would ultimately turn out to be a bad move for him, as it gave the Romans time to regroup, and provided the opportunity for the Epirite army to be whittled away against the Carthaginians in Sicily. Interestingly, Polybius wrote that Carthage and Rome actually did have a treaty to band together against Epirus, and Polybius stated that he read the actual words of this treaty, as the text had still survived during his own lifetime, and it was housed in one of Rome's temples that was used to house various state documents. Now, Polybius says, quote, "A third treaty again was made by Rome at the time of the invasion of Pyrrhus into Sicily, before the Carthaginians undertook the war for the possession of Sicily. This treaty contains the same provisions as the 2 earlier treaties with these additional clauses." And now here Polybius quotes the treaty itself directly, which says, "If they make a treaty of alliance with Pyrrhus, the Romans or Carthaginians shall make it on such terms as not to preclude the one giving aid to the other, if that one's territory is attacked. If one or the other stand in need of help, the Carthaginians shall supply the ships, whether for transport or war, but each people shall supply the pay for its own men employed on them. And the Carthaginians shall also give aid by sea to the Romans if need be, but no one shall compel the crews to disembark against their will." And that was the end of the treaty. However, despite the text of this treaty, neither Rome nor Carthage ended up giving aid to one another, and each nation really just ended up fighting King Pyrrhus on their own. I just find it interesting, though, knowing that we know all of this in hindsight, that this treaty of alliance could still be made in 279 BC, when Rome and Carthage would begin a series of extremely devastating wars against one another only 15 years later. And I think it highlights that they weren't necessarily on this destructive path for war, and that possibly even things could have still been worked out between Rome and Carthage. Anyways, King Pyrrhus went to Sicily to preemptively attack the Carthaginians, as I said, and he was there for 3 years, from 278 to 275 BC. Although he did make some early gains, ultimately he slowly lost everything as time wore on, and as the Carthaginians fought against him successfully. Much like the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War, Sicily became the undertow that dragged down any hopes of victory King Pyrrhus might have still harbored for this conflict. His campaign there ended as a catastrophic failure, and it ruined his army's manpower and morale after he lost several huge defeats against the Carthaginians. Pyrrhus sailed back to southern Italy in 275 BC, but his fleet was attacked by the Carthaginians en route, and he sustained more heavy losses. To add even further insult to injury, he was attacked by a mercenary army once he landed in southern Italy, and he lost even more men. He was able to eventually march his army north toward the region of Campania, where a Roman army ended up meeting him near the town of Beneventum. Our ancient accounts differ on this battle as well, but it does seem that the Roman army caught the Epirates while they were marching and killed many men before they could even form a proper battle line. A large battle was eventually fought in a nearby plain as the day wore on. The Romans eventually won the day, and this sent King Pyrrhus' army into a full and complete retreat. Now, this ended up being the final battle of the war. King Pyrrhus admitted defeat and simply sailed back to mainland Greece, leaving the Romans to acquire all of southern Italy. I'll say the rest of Pyrrhus' life didn't go so well either. 3 years later, he became involved in some power politics with Sparta, where he was defeated and his eldest son was killed. During the retreat home, Pyrrhus' army attacked the city of Argos in the Peloponnese. This city was the home of the legendary Agamemnon, and it seems time did little to lower the fighting spirit of their people. Pyrrhus' army invaded the city and became embroiled in deadly street fighting. Plutarch tells us that at one point, Pyrrhus was himself fighting against an Argive soldier, when that soldier's mother saw what was happening from above as she took shelter on the roof of her home. The mother then managed to lift one of the heavy clay roof tiles, and she threw it down on top of King Pyrrhus, hitting him in the head and killing him. So ended the life of a king, at the hands of a protecting mother. Alright, so let's stop and do another quick recap of where things are at. Let's remember that from Rome's initial founding, around 753 BC, all the way down to the First Samnite War in 343 BC, which is a period of about 400 years, Rome had changed little, and was largely a small city-state. Although Rome had fought many wars against her neighbors and had transitioned from a monarchy to a republic, throughout this 400-year period, her territorial extent had changed little. But from the First Samnite War in 343, we begin to see Rome taking more territory and a wider extent, beginning with Campania and Capua around the modern region of Naples. Then, Rome gained northern Italy up to the Po Valley after defeating the Etruscans, and then all of southern Italy after winning the Pyrrhic War. Although the Celts still controlled the Po Valley in northern Italy, we can see that in just 68 years, from 343 to 275, Rome went from being a relatively typical city-state to conquering nearly all of the Italian peninsula. I'll also add that if you've ever played any of the Rome Total War games, you might be able to remember that this is right about the start date for those games, which was 270 BC. And so you can kind of think of that to give you a picture of where everything is at the current time we're looking at. As the Roman Republic's dominion over the Italian peninsula was finally secured, the city's gaze was about to turn outward. Like a ship emerging from a tranquil harbor out into the open sea, Rome now found herself in uncharted and precarious waters. The conquest of Italy had been a whirlwind, a maelstrom of steel and fire that had swept aside many ancient city-states and tribal kingdoms, leaving Rome the undisputed master of the land. But as the Republic basked in the glory of this triumph, a shadow loomed on the horizon, a specter of war and bloodshed that would soon engulf the entire Mediterranean. Carthage, the great trading power of the sea, watched Rome's rise with growing unease, and the merchants and sailors whispered warnings of the Republic's growing ambition. The Punic Wars, a conflict that would shake the very foundation of the ancient world, was beginning to take shape, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Rome's conquest of Italy was but a prelude to the greater drama that was yet to come. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at romeretold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.